Good afternoon and welcome to the Spring 2020 Linneman Associates Capital Markets webinar presented by Linneman Associates and Valuate Software, a product of Real Estate Financial Modeling. This is your host, Bruce Kirsch, founder and CEO of REFM, provider of financial analysis tools and training to the CRE business since 2009. We're pleased today to have an insightful program for you, which will be presented by Dr. Peter Linneman, founder of Linneman Associates, which for those of you who do not know is a strategic and investment analysis advisory firm. We have recorded today's webinar to mitigate any internet traffic connection quality issues. We hope for the next quarter we can resume the live delivery, but we wanted this to be a smooth experience for everybody. If you wish, you can have the slides up during the presentation. And we've reserved about 15 or 20 minutes at the end of the webinar to answer questions that were sent in advance. And without any further ado, I'd like to introduce the presenter, Dr. Peter Linneman, CEO of Linneman Associates. Peter, over to you.
Hi, Bruce. Pleasure to be here. It's a beautiful day in Philadelphia. Spring is sprung. It's not such a beautiful economy or real estate situation, but it's a beautiful day. Let's go to the first slide and I think it's important to review where we were at the end of the first week of March 2020. And I know those of you who have followed my posts, and we will continue to have posts, keep checking the site as we go through. Some of you have seen these, but if you've not, it's useful to have where we were. We had 3.5% unemployment, which was about 157 million employed, about 5 million unemployed, and looking for jobs. Of those 5 million, about half would have found jobs in the next 5 weeks. That doesn't mean the unemployment would have fallen. It just meant there were new people coming in over that time period. But it was a very active labor market. You only had about 210,000 new unemployment claims being filed a week. And if you think about that, out of a labor force of 162 million, to only have 210,000 starting an unemployment claim, it was a very robust market. That was kind of record low. We were growing at about 2.2% GDP, but it was on the largest economy in the history of the world. We had the highest household wealth ever in real terms. We had the longest recovery ever. Industrial output and profits were both flat, but they were flat at basically peak levels. We had record travel, tourism, all-time highs, both international and domestic. We had very high consumer confidence and high business confidence. Business confidence had been dented a bit by the trade wars, but was still quite good. We had single-family housing starts had gotten up to within about 100,000 of their historic norm after a long, long climb, and you could almost see light at the end of the tunnel. There were very few consumer or business excesses. Business borrowings had gone up, but business debt coverage was still at very low levels. And that's because even though they borrowed more at the lower interest rates, their coverage was actually very strong. You had decent market fundamentals in all property categories, not just office. All property categories had very decent fundamentals, and we still had half of my qualitative canaries still chirping. If you go to the next slide, you'll see what the canaries look like at that time. And yeah, it wasn't early in a recovery, but it was still a lot of indication that people had more brains than money, and they did not believe trees grow to the sky. And then you see the bottom one, the coronavirus fear, the shutdown, killed it all. And I think it's important to understand that, and this is not even to second guess whether we should have shut down or not. I'll come back to that. It was not the virus, it was the reaction to the virus, the shutting down of the economy, an unprecedented act of shutting down an economy, not for a day or an afternoon or a week or like after 9/11. After 9/11, we didn't even shut down the economy, to give a sense. We shut down little bits of it, but not the economy in the same way. Unprecedented. And it has triggered, the shutdown is what has triggered an economic collapse of unprecedented proportion, which then knocks on to real estate, because real estate is only in existence to serve the economy. So when the economy is good, real estate has a decent chance, and when the economy is terrible, real estate's going to suffer. The actions of shutting down the economy, I think when you look back in history, 10, 20, 30 years from now, you're going to go, now, what happened? Something that killed 100 or 150,000 or 200,000 people, at least half of whom were already in nursing homes. And the typical life expectancy of someone in a nursing home is 6 to 18 months. So independent of COVID, more than half of those deaths were going to occur to people who were unfortunately dying, although we've all viewed it as merciful when our loved one sometimes dies after a stay in a nursing home. They're going to wonder what was going on. What was going on? They're going to have a hard time grasping it. And the analogy I keep coming back to, there are two I keep coming back to. One is, how did the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand trigger World War I and all the catastrophe that was associated with that? How did that happen? Well, it did. It was not the assassination that was the problem. It was reaction to the assassination. The other is, how is it that Kennedy sent some military advisors to Vietnam, and that triggers an endlessly bloody and costly Vietnam War where we have hundreds of thousands of troops in country? How exactly did that happen? It's so hard to make the connection. And I think we're going to look back in history and say, how did this disease cause that? Because where are we at today? Go to the next chart. GDP is down about $1.2 trillion. That's not annualized, that's actual. Down $1.2 trillion in 2 months. That's about a 5.4% decline. That is not an annualized 5.4%. That's an actual 5.4%. I estimate as we sit here today, there are about 40 to 42 million unemployed and about 120 million employed. So roughly a 25% unemployment rate. Remember how much the data lags. So we know we had 5 million unemployed at the end of the first week of March. We know that we've had 34 million or so additional unemployed as of a week ago last Wednesday. You know that there were at least 3 to 4 million more in that last week. So when people say, how do you get to 40 to 42? That's it. You get there. And that took all of about 8 weeks for all that to happen. For about 9 to 10 weeks now, about 40% of all American businesses have zero revenue. A typical downturn, every business's revenue falls. This is unusual in that not only are a lot of businesses' revenues falling, you have massive swaths of the economy that have been forced to have zero revenue. Travel, tourism, leisure, entertainment, most retail, other than grocery and some odds and ends, have been forced to basically zero revenue. No business is set up to have zero revenue. Every day that we remain shut down is costing about $21 billion of GDP. That's about 10 basis points a day. So it is actually getting larger because the knock-on effects, this is geometric. If you don't have a job, then two other people don't have somebody to service. It has that same sort of dimension. But a quick and dirty way of saying how much GDP do we lose, just count the number of days and every day add 10 basis points of GDP to it from the end of March. So this is growing dramatically. The 5.4% that we've already lost annualizes to about 36% for the year as a whole. Go to the next. I just want to give you some benchmarks because it's important to understand. The unemployment rate today is about 25%. That was the unemployment rate at its worst during the Great Depression in 32-33, 20% during the second depression during the Great Depression, which was in 1938. In 1982, the unemployment rate was 10.8. During the bottom of the financial crisis, it was 10.3%. Let me just pause on the unemployment rate. We are 2.5 times the unemployment rate that we were at the worst part of 2009. Just, it's an impossible concept to get your arms around because it was only 10 weeks ago was the best economy in the history of the world. And now it is, by the way, I don't want to say it was a perfect economy. It was just the best. And now we are sitting in the worst drop in U.S. history because of the shutdown. And hence I say the analogy to how did we get Vietnam, how did we get World War I? It was crazy, serially, well-intended, but insane with hindsight, policy decisions. During the Great Recession, 2009-10, we lost 8.8 million jobs. We have lost at least 35 million jobs, and we may have lost as many as 37 million jobs. The GDP decline during the Great Depression at its worst was about 26% on an annualized basis. We're running close to 35% on an annualized basis. Now remember, the level then also was much lower. The society was much more depressed. It was much lower. There was no safety net. The decline in 1981-82 was 2.7%. During the financial crisis, the Great Recession, it was 4.3%. We are down more than we ever were during the financial crisis already, and it's going to get worse. And our housing starts are going to go way below. Single-family housing starts are going to go way below the 860,000 or the 460,000 of the most two recent big downturns. And that's because if people don't have money and they don't have jobs and they don't have confidence, you're not going to get a lot of people buying homes. I don't care how low the interest rate is. Go to the next chart. How would you characterize today? Deals, corporate deals, real estate deals, development deals, any kind of deal broken. Consumer and business confidence plunging. It's already gotten to lows and it's still going to fall farther. Rents are not being paid. We'll come back to that. But if people don't have jobs and they don't have faith in the future and they don't have faith in will their company actually be able to get revenues, they don't pay rents. Debt defaults are just going to be starting. Obviously, it really isn't until April and May you're going to see that. You're going to see delinquency rates, debt rates, both business and personal, go up. The economic linkages are getting weaker every day. The longer people are on unemployment, the more businesses go out of business and never come back, the fewer that are going to come. Something that worries me a lot is the graduating class, high school class, college class, graduate school class of 2020, largely jobless and hopeless about getting a job at this point. Horrible situation. I mean, it's a horrible situation, and they don't qualify for unemployment benefits. They don't qualify for any of the assistance that has been meted out. We have a massively increased role of government. In that sense, Bernie Sanders has already won, in that a massive increase in the role of government, not just here and abroad. There is risk of social unrest. You can see it in the same things I see. And COVID still exists. And of course, they knew COVID would still exist. No one advised that COVID would be gone. And in fact, some of the smartest people in medicine I've known have said, well, of course, this is going to take years to get a vaccine. You know, what, are we going to stay shut down forever? And much has happened in Vietnam, where you had a mission creep. The original goal was to give the medical system time to respond and not get overloaded. And that might take a week, that might take 2 weeks, that might take 3 weeks. It has had a mission creep in nobody should die. Well, that's not going to happen. If this disease is out there, it's very mild if you're young and if you're in good condition. It's very deadly if you're older and you have obesity, high blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease, cancer. It's highly deadly. And it's not likely to go away. It may ameliorate during the summer, and then may well come back. That was always known. And people say, well, we're starting to open up, but people are still getting sick and still dying. Yes, people get cancer every day, and we go on. People get a heart attack every day, and we still go on. We do not say, well, gee, we can't go on living because the number of heart disease cases doesn't go down. We can't go on living. This is something that's here to stay, and we have to adapt to it. It's interesting, the notion was to make it so the medical system did not crash, and by shutting down all elective stuff, you wiped out the private pay, you wiped out the profitable part of the business. You are left with you're left with a huge overhead at a medical, with a very limited ICU and emergency service. And most of those are because of the age profile. Most of those cases are Medicaid or Medicare rather than private pay. So hospitals are bleeding money. So in order to save the medical system from self-destructing, we've destroyed it by eliminating their lines of business. Very quick on the math of a shutdown. Even if there were 1 million lives saved a year, remember the United States has about 330 million people, even if we would have saved 1 million lives by the shutdown, and I've not seen any recent estimates even remotely close to that. And by net lives, remember, half of these people would die in the next 12 months anyway, 6 to 18 months anyway. So that means 2 million deaths would have otherwise occurred. We're going to end up losing probably $6 trillion in GDP when this is all done, maybe more. Any medical costs associated with this are rounding error. They're small. If you saved 1 million lives and it cost you $6 trillion to do it, that's $6 million per life. But as I say, if half of those would have died anyway, it's up to 12. If all we end up saving is 100,000 lives net, that's 200,000 or so, 200 to 250,000 total. It's $60 million per life. As I speak, we're at about 74,000 deaths. But remember, more than half of those would have died in the next 6 to 18 months anyway from other causes. Now, people say you can't put a value on life. Governor Cuomo said, life's priceless, I will not put a value on it. Well, the Office of Management and Budget uses $7 to $9 million in some of their cost benefit analyses. The government does that. The one that really struck me is society puts about a $200,000 value on the life of a soldier killed in action, honorably serving their country. And it's a little offensive when these governors say we can't put a value on life, because we're sending our sons and daughters into harm's way knowing that if they're killed, it's basically we valued it at $200,000 in the way we reimburse. Legal judgments come back with values of life in the 1.5 to 3 million. One piece of information I find very interesting is that the death rate among supermarket and grocery workers, as best I've been able to ascertain, is about 1 in 100,000. Now that would mean we'd only have 3,300 deaths. And you say, well, we have already 73,000 deaths. Why is that? And that's because you don't have grocery workers who are in nursing homes. It is a particular profile that this particular disease has sought out. Our grocery stores have basically operated quite effectively without mass death. Those death rates of 1 in 100,000 are commensurate with death rates that you would get among their workers for traffic accidents, cancer, other life-threatening things. Go to the next chart. It is the worst economic situation by far since the Great Depression. GDP, as I said, is down. Jobs have evaporated. Loans that had margin calls got called and have destroyed some companies. Repos were taken, collateral. S&P is down about 16% as of the 24th. And actually, that's when I put this slide together. Actually, that's about where it's still at today. It's kind of bounced around since then. Base rates at the government are near zero. But for a real estate person, those rates don't mean a lot because you can't really borrow in today's world. Nothing can really be financed. That's not totally true, but it is a kind of who cares what the base rate is if the spread is high and nobody will lend to me. Federal debt has risen about $4.5 trillion instantly, not from COVID bailouts, but from shutdown, remuneration, and support. And I'll come back to that in a moment. As I said, all transactions are closed. Rents are in arrears. Loans are in arrears. Office collections ran somewhere as a benchmark 35 to 70% of normal in April. It seems that's the pace they're on this month. Apartments and industrial were up in the 80 to 97%. And for basically anybody who borrowed, forbearance is essential, or at least the potential. What about the government programs? Go to the next chart. These are not bailouts, they're not stimulus. What they are is the government took policies that they were believed were in the interest of society, and they shut down your business. They took your business from you. They took your livelihood from you. They're allowed to do that under the Constitution, but the Fifth Amendment says if they do so, they have to compensate. This is more akin to takings compensation under the Fifth Amendment, where what you're trying to do in a very rapid, rough justice way is make workers who lost their jobs whole, make businesses who lost their revenue kind of partially whole. You'll never make them whole. They're providing lifelines to these companies, but both those lifelines are short, limited, and because they don't deal with high income, they don't deal with other things. And many companies still aren't producing anything. I'm just paying people. Consumers have received money, particularly people. There's been actual salary increases de facto for people who make less than $1,000 a week, at least through the end of July, are now making more money unemployed than they were making employed. And the lower your income per week was, the more that's true. And a very fast example, you were making $500 a week. You lose your job. You live in a state that replaces half your income with state unemployment benefits. So you went from 500 to 250. Normally, you really suffer then. But the federal government, through the end of July, is giving you another 600. So you lost a job where you were making 500 a week, and now you're making 850 a week through the end of July. I think that has bought a lot of social rest. Absent that, I think there'd be massively more social unrest, massively more. And that's why I think they're going to have to extend something like that beyond the July 31st. Confidence is very low. Forbearance buys time but doesn't replace the cash flow I lost. Forbearance gives me time to pay you back, but it doesn't make up for the fact that the government shut down and took away my income for several months or more. You've got business owners who are calling it quits. They're going to retire. They're not going to come back, try to open their restaurant, get negative cash flows, figure out all the brain damage. And so replacing them is going to take time. Go to the next. For the next 12 months, we have what I would call an ISIS economy. That is, imagine what our economy would look like if at its peak it was taken over by ISIS. They'd have shut the stores, they'd have shut the this, they'd have shut entertainment, they'd have shut travel, they'd have shut, and the economy would have plunged, absolutely plunged. If after 2 or 3 months of having ISIS in charge of the government, you suddenly said, and ISIS is out, they've been overthrown, they've withdrawn to the hills, do you think the economy would snap back to where it was 2 or 3 months earlier? No, there's too much damage. There's too much uncertainty of, are they going to be back? Is it going to happen again? Will there be? It's going to take time. It's hard to see how there's going to be a quick recovery. The analogy is it's very different to go from 0 to 100 than 95 to 100. And the typical recovery is going from 95 to 100, not 0 to 100 in mass sectors. At minimum, this is going to take 2 to 3 years. At minimum. Nationalism is going to increase. The borders are going to be slow to open up. The supply chains are going to get shortened. And the role of government is going to radically increase. And if we get social unrest, it's even going to more so radically increase. If I had to make guesses, and these are not from models, if I had to make guesses of where the unemployment rate would be, I'd say we were 22% at the end of April. We're 25% today. It's going to get to probably 30% at its worst. If we're really, really, really lucky, we get 25 million people back to work over the next 12 months. Now think about that, 25 million people. A normal year adds 2, 3, a great year, 4 million. To add 25 million people would be staggering. And some of it's easy. It's the hair salon comes back. It's some of it's easy. Some of it's very hard. If we added 25 million jobs in a year, we would still have something like a 12 to 15% unemployment rate. That is to say, after adding multiples of the most jobs ever added in U.S. history, we would still have an economy worse than 2009 was. And from there, it's going to take a while more to recover. Look how long it took to recover from 2009. The very best you can see is something like 5% unemployment by the April of 22. More likely, that's going to be April 23 or 24 until you get to 5%. That's why I say I'm an optimist. I'm hoping it's by 2022, but that would be massive to do that. COVID would still, in all likelihood, exist, and we have to figure out how to adapt to it. Given that it takes on people who are unhealthy, with diabetes and overweight, and body mass indexes over 40 are the most vulnerable people. It's even not age, it's body mass index. Listen, you want to protect yourself against COVID coming back? It's real easy. Start exercising more, start eating better. While exercise rigorously an hour every day, reduce your calorie intake every day, and you're going to essentially make yourself immune from the ravages of COVID. You may catch it, but you're going to make yourself immune from the worst of it. And if you're not willing to do that, why are we going to spend 40 million jobs on you? We need to get the government out of this process, because the government tends to have one size fits all. My office is very different than your office. My business is very different than your business. My restaurant's very different than your restaurant. The government's trying to come up with a solution for, quote, all restaurants, all businesses. You love your loved ones more than the government. You care about your employees more than the government. You care about your customers more than the government. There's a presumption that you hate your loved ones and are trying to kill them. You hate your employees and are trying to kill them. And you despise your customers and you're trying to kill them. That is simply wrong. And the longer government controls the reins of opening up, the worse the damage is going to be and the longer the recovery. The sooner we say, be smart, be sensible, we'll keep giving you information, you figure it out, the faster we will get solutions. Go to the next. Just a word on oil. Two things happened. One is, as fracking occurred, it broke the OPEC cartel. Classic, right out of a textbook, broke the cartel, because as the price came down, revenues that were supporting whole countries fell, and to offset that, they wanted to pump more barrels to offset the fall in price, and as they did it, the cartel fell apart. Totally coincidentally, around the same time the cartel really was collapsing, you had the shutdown crisis, the shutdown depression. And that made demand collapse, so prices fell even more than they would have, which made them want to increase output even more to offset the revenue drop. It's going to be hard to reassemble that cartel given fracking and given how low prices are. You're not going to probably see the cartel have a real chance of getting back together until you get higher economic situations, higher growth. It won't hurt most of the country, but it certainly will hurt Texas and Houston. I love Houston in terms of its growth. It's going to have a rough year. Houston has oil, but it also has low taxes. It has liking and supporting entrepreneurs. It has very low home prices because they don't have crazy building restrictions. Houston's going to do just fine, but it's going to be a rugged year or two because the oil's pulling down the strong part. If you let consumers drive and fly, they would benefit from this, but they don't much. Go to the next. One of the questions I keep getting asked is, well, we're going to float 4 trillion, 5 trillion, maybe even 8 trillion in debt, trillion with a T. Right now, we have about 20 trillion debt. GDP was 21 trillion. There's this cockamamie modern monetary theory. Put that aside. Let's just do simple finance. It's real easy to see how we're going to pay for this. It's not hard. If we float 4 trillion debt to make up for the policy mistakes, and we match finance that 30-year government bonds. 30-year government bonds are below 1.5%. If we did 30-year debt, that's $60 billion additional interest payments a year on a $4 trillion U.S. government budget and a $21 trillion economy. Now, the economy is going to be a bit smaller and the budget is going to be a bit larger. And my point is, $60 billion is rounding error in those numbers, easily afforded. By the way, even if you say we float not 4 trillion, 8 trillion, Fine. That's $120 billion additional interest expense on locked in on 30 years, or at least we're able, if we want to lock it in for 30 years on a $4 trillion budget. 120 is nothing, particularly in an economy that will grow. Historically, per capita, we grow on the range of 1.5% a year. That means 30 years from now, our heirs, the people we handed that debt off to, are going to be about 45 to 55% richer than we are today. I don't mean in the downturn, I mean than we were in January. And essentially what we're saying is, dear grandchildren, to ameliorate the pain and suffering caused by a tragic set of policy decisions, aren't you willing, out of your higher income, to pay that burden as we go forward? And the analogy is, I would gladly have been willing to pay to ameliorate and alleviate the pain and suffering of my grandparents and parents during the Great Depression. I wish they could have borrowed for essentially nothing at that time. I wish they would have borrowed to ameliorate that generational pain. I would have happily helped my grandparents out, my parents out, with hindsight. That's what's really going on here. It's very different than typical government spending. Typical government spending is some pork project of questionable economic value. The problem isn't the deficit, or do we float it with taxes or debt? The problem is the project itself is not that productive for society. It's not something we're getting our money's worth. Ameliorating and alleviating the pain and suffering of a generation at a generational moment is worth doing. And it's a very different thing than the normal. They will probably print a fair amount of money. The money is going to go in the system. It's not going to cause inflation because the supply is essentially the same of everything and demand is way down. And that means that would push prices down. And they won't go down quite as much as they would have otherwise. And it'll prop up asset prices a bit. There will be some higher taxes to come to cover that extra interest, but it's small. It is not such a big thing. And then, Bruce, let me go really quickly through some property. These are all guesses because we don't know. What's the apartment market look like 2020, the rest of the year? You got to work with your tenants. You're going to have to give forbearance, depending on how long this lasts. You're not going to get the class of 2020 down to the occupancy point. Class of 2020 is going to stay home with their parents because they're not going to get jobs. Many of the unemployed are going to go home. Your occupancy could easily get down to the 88% range by year end because all the normal things happen, except not many people are going to leave to buy a home. But the offsets, the kids graduating, getting a job, and taking an apartment, that's not going to occur. So you need to defer your CapEx, and you need to track the Freddie Fannie forbearance programs. Freddie and Fannie were amazingly fast, to their tremendous credit, to have programs. I think those programs will become the kind of prototype to use in every product category. And essentially what it amounts to is you get forbearance. If you can't cover, you get forbearance. If you can cover, pay. If you can't cover, they're going to sweep the income. And beyond anything that the sweep is not enough to cover, it's going to be effectively a new loan, so you're not in default. That new loan will accrue for 2 years at a pretty low interest rate. It's due in 2 years. What's going to happen 2 years down the line? My guess for most of those are going to say we need another 3-year extension or a 4-year extension to spread it out more. But we'll see. Rents are going to fall. You're not going to go to 88% occupancy or something like that without rents falling. There are not going to be a lot of foreclosures, though, because Freddie and Fannie are going to forbear and banks are going to forbear. Banks have tremendous excess capital for the first downturn in history. And I wrote about this for the last 3 years in Linneman letter, that this would be a very different downturn in that you would not have forced sales out of banks. You will have them out of CMBS, but CMBS is not a big sector. So there'll be very few foreclosures. Most of it's going to be these kind of Freddie Fannie forbearance programs, I think. Go to the office market, going to be lots of rental forbearance. And same comment, you're going to try to collect that later. There's going to be some success in collecting it later. There's going to be some where you're going to restructure their lease in a way, and you're going to try to collect it back on the back end of a new lease. There are going to be huge amounts of loan forbearance in the office sector using something like the Freddie Fannie model. Not that Freddie and Fannie are lenders there, but the model, the template. You're going to see huge deferring of CapEx. You're not going to see a lot of new leases. You'll see some renewals. You're going to see some tenants go bankrupt. There are not going to be a lot of forced sales, again, unless they're CMBS. There's going to be even fewer unforced sales. If a patriarch dies and the heirs want cash, they're going to sell. But other than that, there's going to be too big a bid-ask spread. The old owner is going to say, I want a pre-COVID shutdown price, and the new people are going to want to say, I want a 25% return to come in, and it's going to be a big bid-ask spread. There's going to be a death of co-working space, just dead. And most of us thought that that was a model that was flawed during a downturn. If it was flawed during a downturn, it's crushed during a depression. Their tenants are going to disappear. You add to that the nature of those layouts of very packed, hot seats, etc. Not only is that dead, the number of tenants who put in their own space, the butcher block, hot seat, cool layouts, no cubicles, no offices, those are dead. Those are just dead. And what you're going to see is tenants are going to be coming in and saying to landlords, I need more space because I got to put my workers farther apart, give them more private space, etc. What about hotels in 2020? Again, I think use the Freddie Fannie model for forbearance. Huge carry cost on these facilities. RevPARs are going to be down year over year, sort of 80 to 95%. I think by the end of the year, RevPAR will be off year over year by about 50%. It's going to be ugly. Even though people are allowed to travel, even when they're allowed to travel, travel is going to happen slow. However, I have a feeling that 3 years from now, everybody is going to have adjusted. Will it look the same? No. I mean, in the same way airport travel wasn't the same 3 years after 9/11, you had to take your shoes off. You had to go through the naked body machine. You had to, do et cetera, take your computer out. On the other hand, it was very typical in that people were getting on planes and flying. I think there's going to be return, but it's probably going to take a good 2 years before people really feel comfortable traveling and having fun. But I can't be the only person zoomed out. I'm so burned out with Zoom. Why people want to look at my little talking head, I haven't got a clue. I'm not that good looking. And I'm so sick of the Zoom. I think this hotel sector is going to now start promoting sanitation, and I think that's going to favor brands. In the same way when I'm a kid, Howard Johnson and McDonald's, as brands, did well by promoting sanitation and consistency. I think the same thing. I can see the Hyatts and the Hiltons and the Marriotts showing commercials of how diligently they clean and so forth. If you're not a brand, I think that's harder to get that comfort back. Airbnb, for that reason, will suffer more. It's going to be harder to convince me, especially for the run-of-the-mill Airbnb, that the sanitation is where it should be, given these risks. maybe at the very high end of Airbnb. But this is at least a 4-year recovery path. Retail. Again, forbear with your tenants. Better to try to keep them in business and hope they make it than force them out of business. You don't get any revenue if you force them out of business. Help keep them in business. Hope they can survive. It's easier to keep a tenant than find a tenant. Again, try to use the Freddie Fannie model of forbearance with your lender. Defer CapEx. Occupancy in the weakest centers will be devastated. And the good news is those centers will finally go out of business instead of limping along at $120 a foot. That actually will help the stronger centers because those $120 a foot will come over to them. Stronger centers will survive, but it's going to be a rough 3-year journey. It's not going to be an overnight thing. And I say this both about strips and malls. Good retail is good retail. We are social beasts. Online is not as deadly to retail as you might think because they don't make money on much of what they sell. And you talk about Warren Buffett's comment, you find out who's not wearing a bathing suit when the tide goes out. The tide is going out and you don't make money. So, for example, I think it was yesterday or the day before, Wayfair reported their results. And the results were sales were up staggering and their losses were also up staggering. You go, well, that's not a good business model. Their stock price went up even as they lose record amounts. They're not covering their variable. Quick to the industrial, it'll be solid if you have online tenants, especially the ones that can make money. It'll be weak if you have online tenants who can't make money because somebody has got to subsidize those online sales that are losing money. And in these times, you tend to look for cash flow. Traditional box storage places will be hurt because there's going to be fewer boxes of all types stored. Import-export focused property is going to get hit hard. We know when income's down, people import less. So we're going to import less from abroad because our incomes are down. They're going to import less from us. Those are our exports. So the areas around ports, near airports doing import-export, going to get hit hard. Going to be a lot of forbearance with tenants. And again, if you own a property, try to use that Freddie Fannie model. And this will be a 2 to 3 year journey. Again, not a lot of opportunities. Last thing I'd say, Bruce, is we will prevail. Betting against the U.S. economy, betting against U.S. ingenuity, not been a good bet over the long term. It can be a very good bet in the short term. COVID is either going to be dealt with, or we're going to get ourselves in better condition to build up our immunity, or we'll get a vaccine, or we figure out how do we deal with it. In spite of the shutdown, and remember the shutdown is the real problem, in spite of a shutdown that's continuing going too long and destroying the greatest economy in the history of the world, we will recover. But it's going to be this year is just going to be a year of figuring out, can I survive? How do I survive? And for a few people, how do I take advantage of the opportunity? But it's going to be a journey. So from September 2020, as I say, to September 2021, we could add 24 million, 25 million, 26 million jobs and still have an unemployment rate well over 10%. On the other hand, if you can persevere, if you can take care of your cash, if you can be prudent and not just leap saying, oh, it's got to be a great time to buy. Yes, you want to buy when there's blood on the streets, but not until the blood is pretty much stopped flowing. And I think there's still a good chance of more blood. With that, Bruce, I will stop. And I know there's a handful of questions we'll do for about 10 minutes or so, and we'll wrap up.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. Yeah, we have some terrific questions. Several people wrote in and were wondering, along the lines of your comments in the beginning where you said in retrospect, people are going to say, what the heck happened? If this were to happen again, let's fast forward. Let's just talk about, we get through this, we figure it out, and it were to happen again with something new. How do we do it right? What would we do differently? What would the government do differently, or would we not learn anything, right? I mean,
so I think there's a two-part answer. One is, if it is COVID itself that comes back again, let's say seasonally, it's real simple. We know that it preys on people in nursing homes, so you isolate them. We know it preys on people with cancer, with active cancer, with active heart disease, active emphysema, COPT, etc. We know it preys on people with morbid obesity. We would say, okay, those of you who fit that, we highly, highly recommend that you wear masks, absolutely, and you isolate and social distance as much as possible. We would say to everyone else, get on with your life, use heightened sanitation standards, wear masks, particularly if you're around people coughing or in public transit or at a stadium or something like that. And we would get on with life, period. If it is a new disease, a la what, by the way, just so people understand, even if we have 200,000 net deaths from COVID this year, and remember we're at 73,000 or something as we speak, but those are not net deaths, that's gross deaths. The net's probably closer to 30,000. Even if we had 200,000, it would raise the overall deaths in the United States from 2.8 million a year to 3 million a year. That would be a lower death rate than existed in the United States the first 25 years of my life. We lived in a society with death rates, overall death rates like that. And in fact, the death rate during the last 2 months in the United States is only about 97% of the expected death rate based on 2016 through 2019, which is to say, even though we've had COVID deaths as an additional source of death, and they are, total deaths are down. And what we really care about as a society is total deaths. Now, it turns out that if we get another disease, I think the lesson is we must live with it. We have to find out medically what it is. We have to be prudent. We have to try to identify. We have to try to do. I think the lesson is you can't shut down. The thing I fear, Bruce, is that in the same way people thought the lesson of World War I was the war to end all wars, and it wasn't the war to end all wars. There is a chance that the shutdown will be the economic policy disaster to end all economic policy disasters, but I fear it won't be.
thank you. There's been a lot of pain in the world, not to minimize the all of the sickness and deaths, and there's been a lot of lives lost and a lot of people going through pain. Not to minimize that one bit. Several people have written in about what are the opportunities coming out of this. And one of the things that I can't help but think of is, well, hang on a second. And you mentioned it at one point during the slides, said people are going to need more space. Well, to me, that sounds like a great recipe for real estate long term.
Long term, yes. Short term doesn't matter, right? Because we don't have enough money. So long term, I think you're right for the office sector. I think for the near-term opportunity for the next year or so is going to be in two places. It's going to be as it relates to things like CMBS, where a document says this is what you have to do. I don't think it'll be where a bank so much is involved. There'll be some, but I don't think it'll be so much there. and it'll be in the public market. And I'll just take I have no knowledge, but I only take it as a speculative example. Blackstone bought Hilton in 2007, believing in the future of Hilton when the economy was up. They doubled down in whatever it was, 2009, believing that Hilton still had a good future and a great management team. They worked with that team and did great and ended up taking it public because people are going to travel. They're going to stay. We've had hotels since the Egyptians, 3800 BC or whatever. I can well imagine the Blackstones of the world saying, I know the management, I know the space, I know how much money I have to set aside to make it through 2 or 3 years. I include that in my underwriting. The public market is panicked more than they should. I'll offer the public market a bit of a premium, take them out and do it. So I think the public market is more transactionable. The problem is the numbers involved are big because they're relatively large companies. So, but there'll definitely be opportunities out there.
We've had a number of individuals write in about cap rates. We didn't do our normal set of charts this time through because the world is so abnormal. But one of the questions revolved around if certain asset classes outperform coming out of this, what's the risk of cap rate compression in those sectors, and when do you think that might start to take effect?
So cap rates have done interest rates went way down and cap rates have gone up. So this notion, we've had this conversation for years, Bruce, and we talk about it in the book, which is there's not much correlation, and if anything, it's the opposite, because the rush to safety blew cap rates up, even though interest rates went down, base rates went down. I think cap rates are going to become a sort of meaningless concept for the next year or two because there's so much transitory income. Namely, people are not paying rent and people aren't doing this and I lose some tenants and therefore pricing in a cap rate sense becomes very difficult because each property is going to be very different in terms of their tenancy. I think you have to go back to a discounted cash flow kind of approach again because there's so much. How much is the income going to be down for how long analysis? In fact, in an odd way, I think what you're going to see is cap rates as mechanically calculated are going to go down dramatically. You say, well, how's that going to happen? It's going to happen because I used to have 100 in income and I was worth 2,000, a 5 cap. And now I have a 50 income this year or next year, and my value is 1,500. So the value falls by 20%, 25%, but the cap rate actually goes down because the income's down. I think you're in an odd period that way. You're going to have to think of normalized cap rates and stabilized. So I think it's a little odd to talk about cap rates for the next year or so.
Thank you. We've had a number of individuals write in about leases. What's happening with leases right now? What are you hearing about corporate tenants? We saw a number of news stories about major restaurant chains and retailers saying we're not going to pay our rent. What have you heard? Have you heard anything really unusual, or is it what you expect?
What I think you're getting the public companies are the best window into that. And my advice to people is, in whatever sector you're in, watch the announcements on the public companies because they're reporting, they have to report, and they have to tell the truth. on what their rent collections are. And it varies by property type, it varies by geography, but that's where I tell people to really watch. And it's an evolving story. It's clearly the only sector that gets close to collecting all their rent is a number of apartment people are in the 95 to 100% based on casual conversations and public announcements. But I think you need to monitor that by monitoring public companies in your space over the next, literally over the next month and 2 months and 3 months and 4 months. Use that as your barometer of what the market is.
Well, we're almost about out of time, but I wanted to just ask you a general question is, how do you maintain your high level of optimism?
What's the alternative? That's the best answer. If you said it more intellectually, if you asked it more intellectually, if you look at the long-term picture of, say, U.S. GDP or U.S. employment, U.S. life expectancy, it's a positive picture. And yep, it's got saw teeth on it, right? It's jagged. It's got some downs. But you think about, we've gone through presidents being assassinated. We've gone through flu epidemics. We've gone through major wars. We've gone through bad presidents and good presidents and mediocre presidents. And we've gone through low interest rates and high interest rates and easy money and hard money. And if you look at the picture over 100 years or 50 years or 25 years, it's basically a positive picture you come away with, whether it's GDP or whether it's jobs or whether it's longevity of lives or, you know, almost any way you want to think about it. And so when you're in one of the windows that are down, it's awful. I mean, it must have been awful to have been in World War II era. It must have been awful to be in the Depression era. It must have been awful to be in the 1918 flu epidemic. It must have, you know, I was alive during the 1957 flu pandemic, which killed, population adjusted, it's going to kill probably 2 times what this will kill, and we didn't shut down and the economy grew. And I was alive during the 1968 flu pandemic, which I think population adjusted is about 160,000 deaths, and we're at 73,000 or so. We find a way to, we survived 9/11. So that's how I tend to be optimistic. When I get down, and it is easy to get down during this, you don't get forbearance or whatever. I think you just have to say the long picture is up. The long picture is up. I just have to get to that long picture. And I'll end on this, Bruce. The picture I always had in that regard is, imagine the settlers who left Philadelphia in 1844 and started heading to, I don't care, to Oregon or to California in a walking and with a mule and perhaps a wagon. You got to be kidding me. And they're getting all across the country, going through all types of horrible stuff. And they think, oh boy, we're over the worst of it. And they're walking across the Great Plains going, whew, we finally get to where it's pretty easy traveling. And then they're standing at the base of the Rocky Mountains going, you got to be kidding me. And you just keep your head down, because on the other side is the promised land. And they got there. And yes, there was damage and difficulty. It's that kind of exercise. We're in a difficult phase.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we were not able to address all the questions that came in, but I do want to make everyone aware that this presentation is really just a small taste or digest of what's presented in a lot more detail in the Linneman letter, which is a quarterly hard copy subscription from Linneman Associates. And you can find more information about that, as well as our refi certification program, an educational video series featuring Peter, as well as an ongoing set of COVID-19 economic updates at the Linneman Associates website, linnemanassociates.com. Thank you again for joining, and we hope to see you back next quarter. Hopefully it's going to be a live presentation. In the meantime, stay safe and stay well. Thank you.